complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Yuri Bezmenov, welcome to the channel. How you doing, man?
Comrade Burden, I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation. I always enjoy, and we're in a pretty diverse ecosystem, right? There's a lot of people putting out a lot of good content. But one of my favorite things is when I find someone I should have found years ago. And you have a really great Substack. You've been putting out a lot of good work, and somehow I just completely missed it. And so I think that you reached out to me, and in doing research, I was like, oh, how have I missed this guy? So obviously, I'm a big fan of your work, but do you want to describe, kind of who you are and what you do, just for some of my audience who maybe aren't familiar with it?
Sure. And I had the same phenomenon with you because you've done so many great episodes with all the legends out there. And, I haven't been around that long, only 2 years, but I am putting out probably 2 or 3 Substack posts a week. So I guess a quick summary of what I'm doing. The Substack is called How to Subvert Subversion. And in essence, we are trying to take all of the subversion that's been going around us for easily 50, 60 years and playing a bit of jujitsu with it, primarily through mockery and humor. It's one of the most effective ways to slay the beast, if you will. And I use Yuri Bezmenov as a pseudonym. I think a lot of internet people like us know him. He was a KGB agent who defected back in the 70s, and he's famous because he gave this hour-long talk in 1984 about subversion. So the 4 stages are demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then normalization. It's not about James Bond and hot wars bringing down countries. It's about these active measures that collapse a country from within. So when I saw that video probably 4 or 5 years ago, it really solidified a lot of the things that I and you and people like us had been seeing. So I thought he was the perfect pseudonym to write under because he's already a legend in his own right. He passed away in 1993, just over 30 years ago. So I'm paying homage to him and what he would have reacted to or thought of this clown world that we've now fully devolved into and he basically tried to warn us all about it about 40 years ago. So then who am I, right? I am, you just saw my face, a person on paper who should be one of the fully demoralized NPCs out there. I'm a person of color, so to speak. I am a millennial, and I live in a demoralized city, what I call a Karenland FUPAs, a federation of urban progressive autonomous zones. So I've been in the rooms and been with the people. Oh, and I have a demoralized Ivy League degree. So, in some ways, I feel like I'm one of those dissidents that's in the inner circle of the Politburo, or I'm hanging out with Kim Jong-un, like within a degree of separation or two. So that's a lot of where my stories and inspiration come from. And I loved reading Substack for a while before I started writing, and I felt like that was the gap, to have someone who's been in the bowels of these universities, corporations, cities, and has some tales to tell about all the absurdity. So that's a quick summary about who I am and how I'm paying homage to the real Yuri Bezmenov.
It's an interesting point, you being kind of from Blue America, from progressive circles, because one of my biggest influences, right, is Dave the Distributist, and he has this this kind of concept of you need a red heart and blue eyes, right? That red America, conservative America, has in many ways the right moral leanings, right? They have the certain of the right ideas, but their understanding of the situation is completely bad. It's not accurate, right? They don't understand how the regime works. They don't understand how these elite institutions operate. And I think it's no accident that so many of the kind of like luminary figures in this sphere come from kind of like the academy, come from these progressive areas. And it's because once you're kind of inside the machine, you sort of understand it better, and you can see, how the sausage is made from a certain perspective. And I mean, I certainly, was not an Ivy League student, but, I think like a lot of people, I was really radicalized by college, because you see something that, before or after is a little bit abstracted, right? You hear about like, oh, HR departments are awful, or like, oh, your college professors would be a little bit weird. And then you meet them and it's this realization that's like, oh, you people are awful. And it's just like,
yeah,
okay,
no better way to describe that.
Yeah. And it's like, well, I don't know what I am, but I know I hate you and I want to be the opposite of that. And so I think that that's where a lot of people kind of, end up in these spheres. And I think that your point about humor is dead on, right? Because if you look at how kind of the pre-existing social order got subverted, right, which is very much what men like Bezmenov were talking about. A lot of it was, through kind of humor. Probably the easiest way to see this is in the British context. Men like, what's his name? Cleese, right? Who was an actor, and then, one of the guys at Monty Python. Did a kind of yeoman's work making fun of this kind of stodgy British social order, men in bowler hats, stiff upper lips and all that, and made it ridiculous. And he's a particularly interesting case because he's still around, and is saying like, oh, England isn't British anymore.
Yeah, I guess he's one of those guys who was the original subverter, and now he's seen the damage that he's done, but it might be too late. It's like, oh,
exactly,
wait,
right?
I brought that down, and now I'm still alive. I'm still living it, and I see how bad it is, and it's clearly worse than the stuff that he was mocking before.
Exactly, which is why he's kind of a particularly interesting example. So one of the series you've done, right, is a series of kind of, I almost call them like character sketches, on these kind of, you call them commissars, right? So do you want to describe kind of how you started this series, and I mean now it's like what, up to 5 or 6 episodes? So what is your How to Become a Commissar series?
Yeah, this seems to be a fan favorite with my readers. And I guess before I go into that segment, to describe a bit more of where I'm coming from with this, I am descended from a father and a grandfather that escaped the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And somehow it might be in my blood to be a dissident and to call out bullshit, because they both got in trouble when they were lads, or my dad was a boy and my grandfather was older. But I heard about those stories not until 2020, when we had the Summer of Love, George Floyd riots, and the mass compliance, right? And those images where people are marching around the street holding up their fists are almost a carbon copy of the struggle sessions of the Cultural Revolution. So I take a lot of those themes into my writing. And then I think the first time I was awakened to this concept of these people who suck, aka commissars, right? They're purely political appointments. They're not smart. They're not interesting. They dress themselves up as enlightened, nice, compassionate people, but they're the exact opposite. So that's more or less how I define commissar. And my first encounter with commissars was my first week of college at my demoralized Ivy League university, where I had been invited, again because of my identity, to a pre-orientation where all of the minority students from oppressed groups could move in a week before the rest of the students. So this segregation is already happening about 20 years ago. And I remember thinking at the time, pretty naively, oh, that sounds great. I get to just start my college experience a week earlier. Of course I'll go. And it came with this programming every day. You'd show up to the center, and the first day, right out the gate, they have these facilitators or commissars, college administrators who we now know who are caricatures. And they took all the kids, lined them up, and said, hey, if you have experienced racism in your life, step forward. And if you are feeling overwhelmed by being in this colonized space, step forward. So it was my first real experience with this struggle session, and I immediately felt revolted by it. I was like, we should be happy. This is such a great opportunity. Why is everybody so upset? And me and a few other people just decided to skip the rest of the programming because it was just so obviously a negative. You're creating these narratives that are destructive in people who are 17, 18 years old, and most of them, like me, probably hadn't thought about this much and didn't care. But next thing you know, they're being indoctrinated and groomed to become the next generation of commissars, and now they're running around our society wreaking all sorts of hell. I've seen these people evolve in their careers and take over institutions. So now, getting to the commissar series that you asked about, every once in a while, right, you'll just come across a news article about a person in this regime that just seems too absurd to be true, right? So the most recent one I did was about this Ministry of Truth czar, Nina Jankowicz. And then I did one last month on the new CR of NPO, Catherine Marr. And they're just all so predictable and cringy at the same time. And then when you start to dig in a bit more about what they've done in their lives, and I think LinkedIn's a funny place to do it, it's just carbon copies, copy pasta word salad about, you've got to have your pronouns, you've worked at these NGOs, you've gone to these same universities. So they just become these figures that are so easy to mock. And that's really one of the main ways you can take them down, because I think in their minds, they're high and mighty. They've made it to the top of the commissar ranks. So they should be heralded, and we should all bow down to them as peasants. But instead, I think we should be laughing at them at how absurd they are, and all of the positions that they've risen up to, all of the organizations and institutions that they're now commanding have completely rotted through, right? If they're the ones who are regarded as the best and the brightest going to the top. So this is our way to hasten that downfall, is, at least for me, really focus in on one of them, get all their dirty laundry out, and have a good laugh at it.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up, freshman orientation, because that's something that I have very strong memories of. So I went to a very, very small liberal arts school, and effectively, the political climate was such that, even as a not very political person at the time, it threw me for such a loop. I ended up dropping out. I just completely left school and ended up coming back later. But it was a small program, and initially, like many schools, there had been a men and a women's college, right? They'd merged together in one institution. And so, this freshman orientation, which was, a good amount, like I want to say you came a week before, right? So it was quite a lot of indoctrination. They split all the men or men identifiers into one group, the women in the other. And, this is a small group of maybe 200 or 300 people, all, 18-year-old guys. The lights go down, this kind of like comedically dressed, feminist comes on. And, this is like something out of a comedy. She, quotes the stat about campus rape, you've all heard, 1 in 3. And she literally says, look to your left, look to your right. One of those people is a rapist. I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, well.
Oh, that's hilarious.
This is a hostile environment. And so I'm curious, right? You mentioned that you were, on paper kind of should be a part of this, coalition. And I think a lot of, young men in particular end up in kind of the dissident sphere because they're explicitly disallowed, particularly if they're kind of high achievers, right? If they're kind of, people who in a different order probably would be, pursuing academia, or pursuing kind of high prestige careers, have basically been said like, no, thank you. Straights need not apply, right? To kind of paraphrase an older listing, right? So do you see that kind of like rainbow coalition of, infinity POC sort of breaking apart, or do you think that it's still a strong block?
That's a good question. I think it's hard to see it breaking apart, but you do see it fraying for sure, because in some ways this is a strange creation of capitalism where we've became so prosperous that now all of a sudden every corporation needs a DEI department, and they pay really well in their salaries. So we've created this incentive model where every Africana studies major who otherwise would not be employable can find their way as a DEI administrator at a corporation or university, both of which are flush with cash. So I think you could see this going away just if there's bad performance at these companies, which is happening more and more. And they realize that this is all a big distraction. It's net value destructive. So it's time to wind this stuff down. And then if you start to strip away the different pieces of it, well, yeah, I think the first coalition member to leave will be the white adjacents, so to speak. I'm in that world, and we've got this dichotomy now of the boba Asians who are assimilated into woke culture, even though everything that leftists do is detrimental to Asians, whether it's discrimination in the form of affirmative action and in the workplace as well, or you see all the scenes in cities and near all the Chinese neighborhoods where helpless old ladies are getting beat by the demographic that is heavily Democrat. So this is all things that have real world impact and pain. And the Bobas are still trying to stay in this coalition of, we're still oppressed and you pronounce my name wrong, so therefore you're a racist oppressor and I'm being oppressed. Then you have the rooftops, right, who are like, no, this is all completely bullshit. It makes no sense. And I'm in a group chat with a bunch of these guys. They're all really strong and self-sufficient people. So I think that might be the first group to go. And then I think within the Latinx or Latinx world, it's just kind of like the Asian world. It's so different. Like African Americans are still primarily people who are descended from slavery. So like that's a long common history. Whereas the AAPI, I think they call us now, and the Latinx, they're both they both have their own coalitions that are so massive and different. With Asians, you've got Chinese, Japanese, which could be going back 100 years here, Koreans, Vietnamese, all very different histories and mindset and culture. And same thing with Latinx, right? You've got somebody who walked across the border yesterday from Honduras or Guatemala, or you have a rancher in Texas who's been here for centuries, or people who fled from Cuba in the 50s and 60s. So I think it just makes no sense, right? You can't possibly try to lump all of these groups together and expect them to all march in lockstep with this dumb nonsense that still hurts them. Like I think every group is hurt by leftist policies, but I think the Asians and the Latinx are the first to start to really break away from it.
Well, and I think that what you're seeing there, right, is that if you're looking for what creates like a new identity group, right? It is effectively shared suffering, right? The Spengler's big on this. A lot of the cyclical history people are, which is effectively that you need some kind of tale of, like common suffering. And to be honest, right, the tale of shared suffering for AAPI is not a particularly convincing one, right? It's like, if we're looking at kind of like real ethnic grudges, just because of virtue of like relatively limited amount of time, the difference between if we're digging up dirt on, a Chinese guy, a Japanese guy, and trying to get them to be mad at like a white mechanic who makes 40 grand a year. It's like, okay, well, I guess World War II probably isn't winning anyone any friends, but it's like that narrative only goes so far, especially when you have kind of current economic data, right? Which is that, people from the Asian continent tend to do relatively well in America. And so
yeah, we out-earn white men.
Right. And so my point in that is not to say, well, Democrats don't make sense, therefore they're going to lose, right? It just means like, well, okay, if you've got a guy in your neighborhood beating you up, who is part of the DNC coalition, and a guy who lives 200 miles away who votes for Trump, like, who do you hate more, right? Especially when you don't really have that kind of like 100-year, multi-year century history of ethnic animus like you have. I don't say this is a good thing, but white people and black people have not had a particularly harmonious existence together, right? Like, there's enmity there. And so I think that, a lot of people look at kind of changes in voting pattern and see like, oh, look, just due to immigration, the Democrats are going to win, and there's going to be this kind of like 1,000-year Reich. And the problem is it's like just having a coalition that wins you every election, that doesn't end politics, right? Because the moment you become the forever party, the game theory incentive to split off in fraction, right? To say, well, okay, I'm Latinx or I'm AAPI, I'm not being served by big tech Democrat, like that the value there increases. And so I think that kind of like view of, once the Republican Party dies, democracy dies, I think is kind of short-sighted. And we've seen parties rise and fall in America before. And so I almost wonder, and sorry, I realize it's supposed to be an interview of you, not me just kind of like, rambling here, is that, the Democratic coalition will sort of break apart once it becomes, kind of the hegemon completely, because again, there's that incentive to splinter off, if you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I don't think any regime lasts forever, but I suppose we're at the stage where the pandering has become so obvious and cringy in a way where, like, in the past, maybe people still bought into it. But as more time goes by and I think more evidence piles up that this thing just doesn't work and it's not serving anyone, I think the more momentum you get for a splintering or a shift, whatever you want to call it. But none of this absurdity can possibly last forever.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point, going back to your whole thing about mockery. It's just how embarrassing this regime has become. Like, I think that's why Kissinger is kind of, the death of Kissinger is sort of an important symbol, right? Because, you don't have to like Kissinger personally to admit that he was a competent individual, and you look at someone like, to go back to your series, like Claudine Gay or the CEO of NPR, whose name I cannot remember. Like, it's so obvious that none of these people are here because they are competent individuals, right? They're political appointees. And okay, maybe that's true in any regime to some degree, but at the same time, it's like the emperor just doesn't have no clothes, right? The emperor is dancing around in front of your face, telling you, I don't have clothes. But if you say it, right, that's the problem. And so I see that is kind of a crisis of legitimacy with the regime.
Yeah, well, at least domestically, you still have a big chunk of the population that is so demoralized that they will look at Claudine Gay or the NPR CEO or the Ministry of Truth and go like, yes, queen. Like, I'm so happy to see people who look like me at the top. And I feel so seen now. And that's just a level of demoralization that is still hard for me to grasp. But I think the part that becomes risky for all of us as Americans is that, like, the whole world, the rest of the world, looks at these emperors and laughs the same way we do. And when you have a ruling class who is so utterly incompetent and yet so predictable and narcissistic, that makes them very easy to manipulate and run circles around. So I feel like that's happening in all sorts of ways, whether it's the flashpoints with Russia and Ukraine, or with China and the CCP more or less infiltrating a huge chunk of all of our politicians, but especially in California, where Newsom, the court eunuch, rolled out the red carpet for Emperor Xi, cleaned up San Francisco in an instant when he let it deteriorate for years. You have Eric Swalwell being balls deep in Fang Fang, the honeypot from the CCP. You had the recently deceased Senator Feinstein have a CCP driver for 20 years. So all these things are going to keep coming back in a hard way because, I'm sure if you can easily understand the commissar mindset as a foreign adversary, you can undermine American interests so easily. And they think that they're doing a great job and they get their accolades at home, but for everybody else, including the rest of the world that's trying to stay free and prosperous, it could lead to some really bad collateral damage down the road that we can't even quite appreciate yet.
Well, certainly. And I think that is that demoralization point is actually something I've been writing an article on for a while. And, like many things, it's sort of perpetually a draft for a couple weeks until I kind of like hit the inspiration to finish it.
Yeah, I'm making like dozens of those at any given time. So I know the feeling of like when does it really get ready, or when you have that spurt that takes something that's this primordial ooze into something that you feel is worthy of sharing with your audience.
No, 100%. But it's this idea, and it's kind of a working idea, that part of the reason for the kind of like the disillusionment, the black pilling, is exactly what you mentioned with Xi Jinping and San Francisco, right? Is that so many of the problems that face us are actually relatively easy to solve, and if we just like stood up and said no, stop doing that, we could fix it, right? So for instance, like, okay, San Francisco's a shithole. Okay, you're not allowed to take a dump on the sidewalk. No more homeless people. Oh wow, it's clean again. And that doesn't mean it fixes every problem, but that, what we see at the border with, deliberately cutting razor wire, or, again, what we've seen in El Salvador, where essentially a guy shows up and just says, all right, like crime is illegal again. And
make crime illegal again. There's a slogan.
Right. As dumb as it sounds, but it's like those relatively simple, what we would consider kind of like common sense proposals. Well, they don't serve the interest of those in power. And so it's a non-starter. And I think that's incredibly demoralizing. Just the fact that it's like, these are simple problems that we're not allowed to fix. We're not allowed to, make the kind of like rational option. You just have to live with the negative consequences. And I think that that's kind of the reason for a lot of that demoralization.
Yeah, I think the word demoralization in and of itself is interesting, because it's not what the dictionary would define it as, right? Like demoralization, it could mean that, you're so beat down that you black pill, or it could mean that you just are, amoral or immoral, as kind of the opposite of being moral, of like you have no morals, or you just like don't care. But yeah, I mean, I think for our side, the challenge is to stay white pilled. And I think it helps if you just physically remove yourself from the city. That's what I and my family did. And it's been just such an amazing change. I think first, just starting a family and having a baby around is like white pill into your veins every day. Like, you just smell your kid, and it's like your whole world lights up in a way that it never could before. And then, yeah, you find ways to laugh. And with my Substack, it's one of the most serendipitous parts is to just meet my readers. And I try to get to know people, see what they're doing. And if they happen to be near me, or if I happen to be visiting a city, I'll try to just arrange a get together. So that's led to these beautiful, like, lifelong friendships. It's guys like Isaac, who we both know and have chatted to on podcasts. So I think it's somewhat of an outlet, and everyone can find their own way of building these communities anew. And then, on the other side, I think when I speak of demoralization, it's, these people think that they're winning, but they're really not, because they are so completely submerged into the narrative and the rat race of their status game that they just don't even know what's out, like what the world and what life is all about anymore. It's about this credential chasing and this circle jerk in the elite game, which I've seen up close, and like that's a kind of demoralization that I think Yuri's alluding to, in a way of, there are just some people that you can't reason with, because they've just evolved almost like Pavlov's dogs, where they will respond to certain stimuli, like whatever the latest Trump Derangement Substack writer or CNN or New York Times has written. Like that's it. That's all your brain can handle and how you perceive the world. And for us looking at them, it's like, wow, I can't believe you are a smart person who's gone to good schools and done decently in your professional life, but like this is the level of intellectual and moral discourse that you're left with.
Well, certainly, right? I think that that idea of they're sort of getting exactly what they want is kind of an interesting one, right? Like that's C.S. Lewis's definition of hell, right? Is God giving you exactly what you want? And I think that there's something to that, right? That obviously humans are always status seekers, but traditionally that was kind of there were limits put on your status seeking behavior, whereas this, it's sort of like we've been freed to just pursue that no matter how self-destructive it is. So I think of this example all the time, right? That, I'm from Virginia. I've said it before, and I guess it was 2019 was the governor's race. And, a Republican had a big upset against a Democrat. And, the Democrat Party in Virginia is kind of very established. It's a lot of old money. And one of the guys who I believe was some sort of attorney for some district, I cannot remember. But the reason I remember him is that, he was from a very respectable family.
Oh, is this the guy who tried to like use his trans kid as a campaign
Yes,
prop?
exactly. He used his trans daughter, woman trying to pretend to be a man who sterilized herself, as a political prop. And so the reason I bring that up is not to just wonder at the moral outrage, but we're essentially seeing someone who has let their status seeking behavior basically completely derail their biological imperative, right? Which is to pass on your genetic material. And so, guys like Ed Dutton are really good about this, and basically saying that, birth is becoming a conservative behavior, having children at all, and you've been to the Ivies, so you'll certainly have seen this. One of my good friends is an old school Harvard grad, right? He's in his 50s, very, very established family. And what's interesting is that he left that circle and went to a tiny little town in Southwest Virginia. And it's interesting to hear him talk about it, because he's like, look, like that's a dead culture. No one has kids there. He basically says that like the TFR for his graduating class is, I think it's like 0.7. No one had.
And he's children. In his 50s, so think about how much worse it is now. Yeah, like I remember the last time I was on my campus was for a college reunion, 10-year college reunion, and it's like just you could write like many posts about just what that looks and feels like, because you have, well, first of all, I think the imbalance on campus now and the gender gap politically is you have women outnumbering men 3-2, which already is a hugely disadvantageous dynamic for women to try to find a good man, especially since in college a good chunk of those men are going to be gay, effeminate, just not desirable. So you're left with a few alpha chads in the fraternities and on the sports teams that are going to clean up. And then once you reach the 10-year reunion stage, it's just the funniest and most bizarre thing, because all these girls who were supposedly desirable and had done all the right things, jumped through every hoop like a good obedient lab rat, are now still single, and you can see the look of desperation as they start to potentially realize that almost everything they've gone through was a lie, and they're becoming less desirable for a wife as by the day, and the wall is coming, right? Like that famous moniker of the wall, that biological wall. You can see it all happening, because at a 10-year college reunion, they're hitting their early 30s, approaching to the mid 30s. So like you really have to get serious with somebody during that window if you want to escape that horrific fate of becoming an E. Jean Carroll cat lady 40-50 years from that moment. So yeah, I mean, a bit of a tangent, but I guess that's one of those things you see in this world that just provides fertile material about like all the madness that's going on.
Well, and that's, you sort of have to kind of look at the mind virus and kind of wonder at its, like, how perfectly evolved it is, right? Because you essentially have a system where you take your smartest, most ambitious people, particularly women, but people in general, and basically say, you know, never, ever, ever reproduce. It's low status and gross. And it's just kind of mesmerizing. And look, I'm not a big eugenics guy, but at the same time, it's like,
No, that's dysgenic. That's idiocracy.
Right, exactly.
That first few minutes of that movie has really turned into what what the world is now.
Well, exactly. So the reason why I just find it fascinating is that, again, you see the depths to which people will kind of degrade themselves, for social status. You in your piece on the CEO of NPR, which I highly recommend, because NPR in and of itself is an interesting organization that a lot of people don't particularly understand. Mahler, that's her name, Catherine Mahler. But in that, you see someone who shouldn't need to grovel, right? She's well educated, she's highly compensated, she has a very, very prestigious job, but she just can't stop embarrassing herself to get like tiny little fractions more of kind of social acclaim. And so again, I just find these people equal parts disturbing and fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see maybe a psychiatrist or somebody do like deeper dives on just what drives these people and the motivations. Because yeah, I mean, like, she's a perfect example, because like you could just swap in like thousands and thousands of other girl boss types, and their biographies, the predictable opinions they have, are all going to be identical. So I think that's another element which makes the whole thing so absurd. But it is this really, really strange like hive mind where like her, they want to have their wedding featured in the New York Times wedding section, and like that's where they feel like they got a good flex and can lord over people and be like, oh yeah, I'm so much more cultured and sophisticated and successful than you are. But I just wonder what happens in like their private moments, and maybe they have something that clicks at some point, but they'll just never admit it to other people, and maybe they won't even admit it to themselves, right? Like one example is a boss I used to have. I was working at a company that, give you an idea of the culture of the place. Like the morning after the Trump election in 2016, there was a company-wide email from the CEO offering counseling services and letting people more or less like have the day off if they felt they needed to grieve. So, that, I think that's standard in a lot of companies that are based in blue cities. But the manager I had for about a year when I was there was this woman who openly admitted that she moved to the city because she wanted to be like Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City. And that's where the cultural elements, you start to see the subversion hit so hard, because like this boss I had, she was about 40 at the time, and she was still living the life of like a 22-year-old straight out of college. It was living in a apartment by herself with a pet cat who she loved to show us pictures of. And the part that sticks with me most was when we had a company holiday party, and she got so drunk she couldn't even stand on her own 2 feet anymore. So we had to call a cab for her and like lift her, help her just get down the stairs and get into the cab and send her home and make sure she was okay. So she's one of thousands of women in every city that more or less is like this. And sometimes like I just couldn't hold too much eye contact with her, because I would feel this like despair. And sometimes like when she got animated, she would flash the senpaku eyes, you know, like just really big egg whites, and you're like, oh man, like there's probably a lot of SSRIs maybe back there, and who knows what else, but it combines a lot of the physiological and psychological things all into one. When you see these case studies of what demoralization brings to our world.
Well, and that's actually why I think NPR is an interesting example of that, right? Because, you know, your term commissar sort of works multiple ways in that example, right? Because the reason that, you know, so many people are kind of obsessed with this, you know, obviously self-destructive, status hierarchy is that it is so reinforced in media, so reinforced in popular culture. And so, you know, the very mechanism that, you know, would have made someone kind of in a particularly agreeable, like Eisenhower conservative type in the 50s is the exact same thing driving them to become these kind of like progressive nutcases, you know, which is that mechanism that basically tells you like, oh, this is what culture tells me to do. This is what TV tells me is, you know, kind of high status. And NPR is kind of an interesting example because NPR is high status, and NPR, more importantly, is something that people who want to be seen to be high status associate themselves with, right? So even in kind of like red state backwaters, like where I'm from, one of the ways that people kind of mark themselves out as, you know, like liberal or progressive or, you know, on the right side of things, you know, is their little like NPR local station sticker, you know, on the back of their Prius or the back of their, their Subaru. And it's interesting because I didn't realize how big of an organization it was. Obviously, this like government funded organization is like the first and second biggest, you know, news show and talk show in the whole podcasting world, right? And, you know, the ability to take something which is the largest single option and rebrand that as like a special, unique thing for smart people is a really interesting type of power, right? It's an immense amount of narrative control.
Yeah, and you see the CEO and the previous CEO have all these ties to NGOs that are likely run by our three-letter agencies like the CIA. And it really starts to make you wonder. I try not to go far into conspiracy world. I just try to explain, well, like these are the incentives in place, and these are the results and the personalities that are driving all sorts of trends. So, you know, it's like sometimes you just have to ask people, like, you know, why do you believe this? It's not about, all right, let's have a debate and try to prove each other wrong and all that. It's, you have to go deeper into the why. And, you know, why do you want to become CEO of NPR? Why do you want to write on LinkedIn about how humbled you are to be honored by this or that? And I think you're right in that what you might find is that people will answer that question by saying that their reason for doing this is because that's what everyone should want. And that's what is considered by society to be successful. That word success is very strange now, right? But they are almost doing it out of this mimicry, and they're not really taking that step back for themselves to reflect, okay, well, what about me? Like, what do I want? What are my reasons for believing something or pursuing something? And I don't know if you've seen some of those videos with Peter Boghossian, who does street epistemology, but I've had a chance to meet him in person. He's a phenomenal guy, and you should try to potentially have him on your show. But one of his findings, which blew me away, is that sometimes, like, you'll ask people to move in this semicircle of 5 positions, like strongly agree, neutral, strongly disagree, and they'll go to the street, they'll ask random people questions, and they'll see where they stand. And then, of course, the best part is when they try to have those people examine what they just did and say, okay, I see you moved to the strongly agree. Why did you do that? And a lot of times the demoralized NPCs will say, well, that's just because I took this position because that's what makes me a good person, or, you know, that's what good people believe. So there is no like reasoning, whether it's through logic or emotion of, you know, I had this experience and this is why I'm over here. It's just about, well, everyone else would say that this is the right place to be, so this is where I'm going to be. So it truly is this complete mind virus takeover of a host, where there's the human part of experiencing things for yourself, forming your own opinion, has completely gone and been replaced by, oh, like the NPR lady said this, and so I'm going to copy her good think.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the connection between intelligence agencies and NPR, right? Because the example I always think about, and this is something I learned from progressives, is the fact that the DoD has been involved in the production of Call of Duty games since roughly 2012. And look, like, don't get me wrong, their motivation is very, very obvious there, right? And that's not a particularly like serious part of culture. And if you accept that premise, right, which the Guardian says, the New York Times says, it's not tinfoil hat stuff, right? That they're involved with an entertainment franchise that is big, but isn't as influential when it comes to who listens to it as NPR is, and assume like, okay, well, they do Call of Duty, but they never, affect the news. You just look at that and you're like, okay, well, come on. I'm not going to believe that you have, that our glowies have the kind of like ethical hangups not to, kind of like lean on their connections in the news world. And I think that, perhaps one of the most interesting things you do in each one of these is you just go through someone's LinkedIn, right? And go through essentially every organization they've worked for. And you see that sort of, revolving door kind of as a helpfully like illustrated, like timeline. Right. And you see someone who is, now got a job at an art college or some sort of like, media institution. And it's just like, oh yeah, just had a brief stopover at the Council of Foreign Affairs, just kind of like these like just kind of fleeting connections to, again, what the MAGA people would call the swamp, or like the MIC, or, kind of like the apparatus of power.
Yeah. And I think LinkedIn is a gold mine for material, because I have to be on it anyway for my day job. But it's I think the best way I've seen someone describe it is it's just completely flooded with toxic positivity. So I think that's what drives a lot of this behavior, because it's just a nonstop signaling game. And your goal, if you are a LinkedIn power user who likes to post a lot, is to get likes. And the way that the average corporate person is now, it's very much subsumed into the leftist narrative. So I think this NPR person, like, she has her pronouns. This stuff used to be more hidden, right? Like, you only know what someone's work history unless they'll submit their resume to you. But now it's open for the entire world to see, and then you really start to uncover that it's like this revolving door. And again, like, not to say that there's a top-down conspiracy, but when you have these groups of people who are mutually self-reinforcing, and they're here trying to make the moves up the ladder and support each other's initiatives, like then yeah, like, you just, especially when everyone's so ideologically captured, they're not going to understand any dissent. They're not going to understand if something that they do is going to cause harm. They'll just keep fluffing each other in this really strange mutual back scratching, and you get to see it all play out in public on LinkedIn.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of like anti-LinkedIn sentiment, and all of it is completely justified. It's kind of a horrifying place. But that seeing that kind of like those kind of like circles form from the outside, sort of being let into the club, is super. It's super valuable. You
and it's also good if you want to avoid working with toxic people. Like, I think just pronouns are enough to put you off. Like, if there's another decent candidate that is doesn't have it, then I'm sure this already happens, and people will never say it because you're not allowed to. But I also think, like, if you did some kind of meta-analysis of, it's like all the companies, and you scrape the data, and you're like, all right, which companies have the highest percentage of pronoun employees? like short those freaking companies if they're public. You know, like you know that there's going to be all sorts of terrible things happening within that are going to destroy the capability of that company to get anything good done.
It's funny you it's funny you bring that up. I have a little tip for any of the viewers who are still in school. If you go to a university that receives federal funding, in many cases they are required by law to update your file with your preferred pronouns, and you can change them as often as you want. And so my whole last year of college, I would change my pronouns basically on a whim. I'd be like, all right, it's Tuesday. I feel like I'm a he, she. It feels like that kind of day. And so you can sort of maliciously comply yourself into a situation where they just don't want to deal with you. And I mean, look,
you're just like throwing sand in the gear.
Yeah, exactly. Like, is that a good use of your time? No. But are you wasting their time? Yes. And that is sometimes the most
because otherwise these are just make work commissar jobs, right? The whole point of like DEI and ESG is to take these people that have no way of adding value in a real economic sense and giving them something to do so they can start paying off their student debts, or you know, I guess now we're forgiving those debts on top of it. So yeah, it's like this web of commissars that are all interlocking and, you know, forming this Politburo of the regime. So it's just like fascinating to borrow all these CCP and Soviet terms and see how they're playing out in modern America.
Well, definitely. And you know, in certain moments I kind of like, you know, have this fantasy like, oh, what would you do if, you know, you were the guy in charge? And I feel like if you could make one move that would hurt, you know, kind of the regime patronage network, you know, more than anyone else, it's basically to get rid of, you know, in a certain way, the kind of like student loan like trap, right? Because really student debt is actually a masterful way to direct resources and keep people in your camp, right? Okay, so the system as it works basically lets you fund an ungodly amount of money into institutions that employ your friends, right? Brainwash the children of your enemies into becoming your friends, right? And then they're on the other end, and all of a sudden they have a millstone around their neck that they constantly need to be servicing.
Yeah, it's like indentured servitude all over.
It is, right? It's and again, like all morals aside, you have to look at it as just like, I mean, game has to recognize game, right? Like it's a masterfully designed like political system.
Yeah, I mean, the goal of a system is the outcomes that it gets. So, right, if you're trying to do everything you described, the way it's set up right now is really getting it done.
Well, and I think that's one of the interesting things, because I kind of came of age during the Obama era, you know, and it seems like, at least from my memory, that's really when student debt became the type of, you know, major kind of like political talking point it is now. And I remember Obama passing, or something had to do with this idea of, you know, gainful employment, which is basically, you know, he wrote this, what amounted to a strongly worded letter to universities that says, you know, Simon says you must make sure people can get jobs with your degrees, you know, or we won't give you federal loans. And that's such an interesting perspective, right? Because there was no teeth to it. There was no enforcement to it. It was basically just like, it'd be nice if you did it.
Does a community organizer count as gainful employment?
Yeah, really, right? The Obama rabbit hole is something for another time, but valid point, right? and it effectively is, it goes back to that idea of the purpose of the system is what it does, right? Like, is the purpose of higher education to basically train people for a vocation? It's like, okay, well, in certain circumstances, yes, right? Like you probably need to go to medical school to be a doctor. But I mean, you know, you work in the corporate world, so do I. Like, is anyone under any illusions, you know, now, right, in the year of our Lord 2024, that college realistically prepares people, right? Like, I graduated during the COVID years and I didn't learn a single thing. Like, I didn't learn anything over COVID, and everyone knows it, right? So it does seem like another situation where the emperor has no clothes.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people will tell you that they didn't learn much in the classroom in college, and that most of the value comes from what you did outside of the classroom, whether I was in a fraternity, which was a great experience. You can be on a sports team or join these engineering or entrepreneurship groups. So that's really the value, especially when you get to the Ivy League, because that everyone there is, for the most part, smart and ambitious, and you will find ways to collaborate down the road, and that's what really matters, not what your Econ 101 class taught you. So yeah, I think education is a really important place to, I really liked your last piece about like what's a win, right? Let's rack up some W's. So I think it just starts from the cradle. We as conservatives are going to have more children, and we are going to raise those children because we know what awaits them in the schooling system. So whether you play in the system or you try to exit the system with homeschooling and whatnot, you're still very much in control of establishing a good moral and educational framework for your kids. So like that was one of the main motivations when I started 2 years ago, because I was about to become a father, and you start thinking longer term, what do you want to leave behind? What are you going to put out there to be a guide for the next generation? And then, yeah, I think on top of education, you do have to, if you're serious about winning in the culture, set up these patronage networks that the left is so good at, because like there seems to be an endless bottomless pit for paying DI commissars, and the most elite ones get these grants. It could be some dumb like art nonprofit. It could be the MacArthur grant, which the esteemed Ibram Kendi won back in his day. So like this is what we're up against, and it feels like we're charging into these machine guns, and we've got stones and arrows. So I do hope that for people listening, if there is access to that type of appetite that has funding and resources behind it, because we have the quality, like there's no argument on that. And I love to see so many of the people that we both know continue to rise while the mainstream media and institutions fall. But I think to reach that next inflection point, you do need that type of backing and to build this larger machine that will continue momentum for all of us on all fronts.
Well, I think that's a great note to wrap things up on. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, I'm a Substack stan. That's really where I do all of my writing. So it's yuribezmenov.substack.com.
And I just want to say, you're a Substacker. If you're not on Substack, you're really missing out. Substack is almost entirely censorship free, at least for the moment being. And there are so many people putting out so much good content that it really just blows every other platform out of the water. So if you're not on Substack, you should be. I highly recommend it. And it's particularly,
the leadership team, I got to say, they are top notch. They're extremely thoughtful about the free speech issue. They've taken a stand and held their ground during the manufactured hysterias that they've witnessed over the past couple of years, especially the most recent one. And yeah, I mean, I think the sheer quality and quantity, like I recommend 15 other Substacks to help people grow. And these are all guys that I've broken bread with in person or had on my podcast as well. And I think Substack is the place. Like I basically, my entire newsfeed more or less now is Substack as just a reader, not a writer. And I'm not really watching or reading any mainstream sources anymore, because like Substack will have it covered. So that's where they stand right now. And I think they're a critical front. They've had some skirmishes with X. People have their opinions on X/Twitter and Elon, but I think Substack is truly coming into its own right now.
Well, definitely, man. And if you guys want to support my stuff, you can obviously find my show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a Substack under the same name. If you want to support us more directly, the best way to do that is to head over to Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Starting a new block, really going well. It is growing quickly. And the kind of camaraderie you get in addition to truly world-class programming there is hard to beat. The group chat is wild. It is highly motivating to have a large group of strangers on the internet call you names for skipping a workout. And again, I can't thank JD enough for that. Yuri, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure, Comrade Jay Burden, and hope to chat again soon.
Definitely. And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.